The clone troopers of the Grand Army of the Republic were bred for a single purpose: to be frontline soldiers in a galactic war. Everything tailored about them was tailored to fit that purpose. But at the end of the day, the clones were still human, and they were still individuals, no matter how hard the Kaminoans tried to shape them into living droids. They all had their own peculiar interests, likes and dislikes and desires, just like any other soldier. But other soldiers weren't the property of their governments, and this begs a question. Just how much freedom were the clones given? In this video, we'll be answering that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
There's no softening the fact the Republic's clone troopers were slaves, wholly owned by the Republic and treated largely like property. There was also a whole lot that they weren't allowed to do, as they were generally forbidden from having any sort of life outside of the military. Even clones who weren't actively participating in a battle were locked in cramped barracks when they weren't on duty. On Kamino, they had been treated just as badly, if not worse, because the Kaminoans also viewed them as little more than living droids. With that said, life under the Republic was a marked improvement for the clones. The Republic, at least, didn't care about forcing clones to completely abandon their individuality. The clones did have some degree of freedom from the outset for certain combat-related matters. Even on Kamino, they were allowed to choose their own weapons as they saw fit, within reason. Most clones could only choose between the DC-15A blast rifle and the DC-15S blaster carbine due to limited supplies of other weapons. But hey, a choice is a choice. For the luckier clones, the DC-17 blaster pistol was also an option, though officers got first dibs on those. Certain clones were trained in heavy weapons and were allowed to choose from a much larger arsenal, which included the DC-15X sniper rifle and the Z6 rotary cannon. That was pretty much all the freedom the clones were afforded before the Clone Wars. As we've said in prior videos, the Kaminoans were monsters, and they were ruthless in how they treated the clones. But once the Clone Wars kicked off, the clones were handed over to the Republic, which placed them under the command of the Jedi. The Jedi had their flaws, especially as generals, but they weren't Kaminoans, and most of them felt compassion for the clones, even if they ultimately did nothing to help them in any meaningful way. They encouraged clones to act as individuals, granting them more freedom of choice in the process. Under the Jedi, clones were allowed and even encouraged to take on real names and to style their hair however they wanted, as long as it fit under their helmets. Curiously, many clones continued to identify with their numerical designations in spite of this. The majority of those who did take on names believed their names were the business of themselves, their batches, and their commanding officers only, and only told others their numbers. Most clone names were related to aspects of their personal identities. Commander Gree, for example, chose his name as a nod to his interest in xenanthropology, while Echo got his name from his habit of quoting regulations word for word. Clone hairstyles also varied, though they weren't as personal. Many clones dyed their hair either permanently or as a temporary measure. Captain Rex, for example, is known to have briefly dyed his hair blue to celebrate the victory of his preferred shockball team. Others had haircuts with more serious symbolic meanings. Commander Gree's double stripe hairstyle, for example, was a show of mourning for the brothers lost in the Battle of Tibrin. Some clones grew out their facial hair a bit, while others went an extra step and got tattoos. A number of clones had rather elaborate hairstyles with tattoos, which makes sense, considering there wasn't much else to do in the barracks. As the war went on, uniform regulations began to loosen up a bit too. Originally, the Kaminoans put strict regulations in place regarding the paint jobs of Phase 1 armor. Rank and files would wear plain white armor, while officers were assigned specific colors and patterns. While this was partly due to the Kaminoans' obsession with collectivity, there was actually a better reason for it as well. The Kaminoans saw part of the ultraviolet spectrum, and what most other species perceived as plain white paint was actually marked over in ultraviolet colors, which gave Kaminoans detailed information about clones just from a glance at their armor. But the Republic didn't really need such a system, so they gradually abandoned Kaminoan armor regulations. Battlefield promotions meant that many clone officers ended up having the wrong armor color, and after a few months, rank colors started to get phased out entirely. Officers began painting their armor whatever colors they wanted, often in unique patterns, and slowly this started to spread to the rank and files. Colors stopped meaning ranks and started meaning units, as elite clone units started picking colors to identify themselves with. This system was made official with the debut of Phase 2 clone armor. With the release of Phase 2, most clone units started picking colors and patterns, with individual clones often adding their own flair. By the end of the Clone Wars, standard all-white Phase 2 armor became an exceedingly rare sight, as most clones at least went with the standard colors and patterns of their units. These patterns ranged from the simple blue stripes of the 501st Legion to the vibrant color schemes of Commander Doom's unit. Clones also gradually gained the ability to customize their armor. When Alpha 17 set up his clone officer training program on Kamino following the Battle of Jabim, he encouraged his trainees to customize their armor more. Equipment like visors, rangefinders, helmet-mounted macro binoculars, pauldrons, and cameras, all of which were previously reserved for ARC troopers, became available to Alpha's trainees and eventually to all clone officers. Graduates of his program made extensive use of this new equipment, often mixing and matching it to suit their preferences. By and large, that stuff was reserved to officers, but there were exceptions. Helmet-mounted rangefinders and macro binoculars were issued to some clone privates, and a few specialized clone types were allowed to use cameras, pauldrons, and similar gear as well. For the most part, this sort of additional equipment was distributed as needed, largely to the clones who could make the best use of it. Those clones who had the option used it to customize their armor even more, further individualizing themselves. Unfortunately for many clones, fancy gear was pretty much all the freedom they had, at least at first. At the start of the war, Republic policy was that off-duty clones were to remain in their barracks. They were allowed recreational time, but they didn't have too much to do that didn't involve training and such. Clone recreation typically involved sabak, pazak and similar games, working out, sports, holovids, and reading whatever was available. Additionally, while it's never explicitly stated, we can safely assume that many bored clones took the opportunity of recreational time to go on hot dates with their right hands. By 21 BBY, however, Cal Scarada had managed to talk the Senate into granting clones military leave, and options opened up for their recreational time. Clones were still forbidden from having a life beyond the military, which meant they weren't allowed to form any personal relationships with civilians, though clones probably had one-night stands anyway. However, they were allowed to pay visits to entertainment districts near their barracks, if there were any, where typically they would get drunk and have a grand old time. After a few months, this led to a tangible change in nightlife on planets with large permanent clone garrisons. On Coruscant, for example, clones from local barracks frequented the Cantina 79s enough that it became known as the Clone Bar, and it was avoided by many Coruscanti. Clone bars across the Republic developed bad reputations with the locals, as the clones were a pain to deal with when drunk. Clones had a tendency to get absolutely hammered when on leave, and while drunk, they'd harass other bargoers and passerbys alike. They were, after all, genetically engineered to be aggressive, and while they typically displayed a level of self-control, we're all familiar with how alcohol affects natural aggression. With all that said, while clones did get some nice privileges, having the Republic pay for your drunken revelry doesn't make you any less of a slave. Clones were not free by any stretch of the imagination. They were still the property of the Galactic Republic, which saw them as living droids whose sole purpose was to die fighting for the Confederacy. But the saddest part is that not many of them recognized this. A few saw it, like Sergeant Slick, but for the most part, clones simply didn't understand the concept of freedom enough to realize that they didn't have it. So that's our look at just how much freedom of choice the clone troopers had. But what do you think? Did this answer any questions of yours? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you go guys, as usual, make sure you check out the links in the description, including our Relax Jack music channel, where you can listen to the music we played in the background of this video unobstructed, and the Patreon if you want a closer link to myself and my team and access to some of the thumbnails we post on this channel, including the one on this video. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.